Student protesters across the United States are demanding that their universities divest or pull out investment from Israel. That's the moral thing to do. That's what justice demands, they claim. But they are wrong. Some of them are outright nihilists, out to burn things down. The innocent ones are misled, corrupted by a set of evil ideas about what morality is. What does justice demand? We're going to cut to the essence of this crusade to divest from Israel today. We'll do that by leveraging the immense power of Ayn Rand's philosophy of reason, the system of ideas behind Atlas Shrugged. If you're new to the channel, please subscribe. And if you're watching us live, please comment, or we'll read your comments whenever you post them. And we'll always put links to resources in the description below, including an opportunity to read Atlas Shrugged for yourself and other resources about Ayn Rand's ideas. Onkar, let's start with, what is this divestment crusade and what is its background? Maybe you can give us some background there.
Yeah, it labels itself the BDS movement, and BDS stands for boycott, divest, sanctions. So divest from Israel, and they want governments to impose sanctions on Israel. And it predates October 7th, what's happening in Gaza today. And the demands have ranged from a variety of things, of cutting ties with companies that are involved with the Israeli military. Lockheed Martin is one that's singled out often in the US, to cutting ties with and trying to boycott companies that are involved in building some of the settlements in Israel, and particularly when you're looking at the academic world and what's happening on campuses, calls to cut ties with Israeli academics, academic institutions. There's one, the NYU Department of Social and Cultural Analysis said they're going to boycott their Tel Aviv campus because they want nothing to do with Israel. So that's what they're after. They claim that these are our goals, is what we're trying to accomplish. And it's obviously it's focused on Israel, but one of the things to think about in assessing this is to look at what else do they subject to criticism, and what other organizations, nations, governments. And what you do find is that they do, for some of the other governments in the Middle East, they will criticize them. They will even, I was surprised, but they will even call something like Saudi Arabia a dictatorship, and they will lament its record against human rights. But when you read enough on these sites, and you can just Google BDS and you'll find some of these coalitions, and you can read a lot of their literature. What you find is what really, I think, animates them against Saudi Arabia, for instance, is that Saudi Arabia is trying to normalize, or was trying to normalize, in scare quotes, relations with Israel, and that's really what bothers them, and not so much what Saudi Arabia's actual record is and human rights record is. And this is particularly important because what they say their basic premises, so this is on one of the coalitions, if you look in their about statement, BDS upholds the simple principle that Palestinians are entitled to the same rights as the rest of humanity. Close quote. That's how they put what they're about. They're about the rights of Palestinians. And then if you ask, if that's what you're concerned with, and if you think, what aren't you criticizing? What aren't you calling for divestment from and boycotts of? And I think if you ask that question, conspicuous is by its absence, that they're not calling for divestment from or boycotts of Hamas, the Palestinian Authority, Iran, and more broadly, the ideology that is animating these groups, and particularly that's animating Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran. They export arms all over the region. They're not calling, we need to divest from this. And the ideology is a kind of Islamic fundamentalism. And before that, and it really growing out of that, is an ideology committed to socialism and communism, a totalitarian ideology that deprives everyone of their rights. And if you're not focused on that, or at most you have some kind of, I would put a tepid criticism of Hamas. Of course, what they did in October 7th was evil, but, and then the but is, oh, but they're being, all Palestinians are being lumped in with Hamas and so on, without trying to figure out and say anything about the vile cause that Hamas has from inception has said they're committed to, what they've built in Gaza, and the way in which, if there are innocent people in Gaza, the way they've put them all at risk with the military apparatus, the tunnel system, and so on, they've built there, and the support that they've received from part of the population. There's no condemnation of any of that. And then that tells their whole orientation is against Israel, even though they'll put it as we're pro the rights of Palestinians. When you look at it, that doesn't seem what's animating them.
And just to emphasize the centrality of this perspective, at Columbia, where there were notorious protests for the last weeks, and then at Brown, where the protests and the encampments were recently packed up as a result of a deal with the administration, and at many, many other colleges and universities around the country, this claim for divestment was central to their demands. It wasn't the only thing, but it was, I think, top of the agenda for many of the students at these encampments and protesting and taking over buildings. And I think it's important to understand how big a demand this was. So a lot of these universities have endowments, which is these massive investment funds that fuel their expenses, and they cover scholarships, they cover research. They're just immense buckets of money. And the students were demanding that the universities look through those investments, which are very complex, and then pull out, isolating just Israeli companies, Israeli investments and partnerships. There's a whole conversation to have, which is not our focus today, about how difficult that would be. But leave that aside, because I'm sure that's doable if somebody spent enough time. I think it's an index of how significant an issue this is in their minds. They think they want billions of dollars pulled out of these endowments that are in Israeli. So this is how great a crime they think the universities are committing in their name, or however they would phrase this. And when I was thinking about how to present this topic and how to title it, the word crusade came to mind, because to me, it's a kind of religious mentality. It's not grounded in the facts. It's not rooted in any evidence. So you gave examples of how the BDS perspective is oriented. And I think there really is something religious, tribal about this mentality. It's not concerned with the facts. It's not really trying to get at what is the truth, what would justice look like here. And it's really, really scary that this is what's happening. So you mentioned that, I just want to pick up on something else you said, which was how little is said about Hamas and its attacks, and they did bad things, and here's what we actually think kind of formulations. In reading news reports about the students who are calling for divestment, one of the things that leaps out is how little they're interested in talking about what happened on October 7th. So there's one article I read in the New York Times. The journalist was trying to engage them. What do you think about what happened? What's your position on it? And the terse reply from the summary of it was they don't want to talk about it. They're just not interested, and it's not even clear how much they know about what happened. So there's this just blinkered, uninterested perspective that we have a cause. We have what we think is a moral cause, which is not. And they're animated by this in defiance of the facts and indifference to the facts. So I think that there's a real detachment here. And that's one aspect of why I think it's right to think of this as a crusade, and crusade carries negative overtones. And I think that's what needs to be emphasized. This is really, really destructive.
And part of what's important is, and this is what we need to go on to talk about, it's a crusade not for a positive, even if they want to pretend that, what we're about is freedom and rights for the Palestinians. When you look at what they actually say and what they're concerned with and not concerned with, if you cared about Palestinians in Gaza, how could you not care about the nature and actions of Hamas, not just against Israel, but against Palestinians themselves? Like, how can that be not an issue of concern? But if what animates you is we need to oppose and tear down Israel, then what happened on October 7th, yeah, you maybe to not lose complete support, you have to say, yeah, of course that was evil, but um, and then the but is, well, but the whole point is that we need to tear down Israel, and I mean, it shouldn't be that much of a surprise if the whole focus is to boycott and divest from Israel and nobody else. That what really is animating them is to tear down Israel, not any positive goal and the rights or freedom of any individuals, Palestinians or Israelis.
So I want to turn to another topic, which I view as the best summary for it is this is to expose or underscore the fundamental dishonesty of the BDS crusade, and specifically the demands for divestment that we're hearing on college campuses. So let's talk about what is the model for that BDS is following, because it's not original. And as you'll read, if you explore the BDS movement that's been around for a couple of decades, they see themselves as following in the footsteps of the efforts to pressure South Africa during the period of apartheid. So people who might not know, apartheid was an explicitly racist policy or set of policies in South Africa that subjugated the black population. And if you know a little bit about Jim Crow is like apartheid light. So apartheid was really, really evil. It meant that black people and white people couldn't get married. There were jobs that black people couldn't hold. They didn't have the vote. They weren't part of the political system. They weren't even second-class citizens. It's a question whether you even think of them as citizens. And there were curfews that were subjected to. It's just really maybe one step up from slavery. It's really evil as a regime. Including putting black people in certain neighborhoods and not letting them enter other areas. So it was really a fundamental evil. So what happened with South Africa is there was a campaign of attempts to boycott South Africa, to divest from South African companies, and to sanction it internationally. And there were efforts to do that were, I think, partly successful. There was a lot of attention on this, at least in the 1980s when I was paying attention to it. And internationally, what happened by, I think it was early 1990s, 92, 93, the apartheid regime collapsed. They gave up on that whole idea. And this is seen as a victory for the model of pressuring countries through these means, which are boycotts, divestment, sanctions, and so forth. And the analogy then is, well, Israel is an evil regime on this view. It subjugates the Palestinians in a so-called apartheid state, or Israel is an apartheid state, as they would argue. And therefore, that's one reason to apply these sets of tools to pressure it. And I think this is fundamentally dishonest because we've talked about this in other podcasts on the channel, and this is something I talk about in my book, What Justice Demands: America and the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict. The idea that Israel is an apartheid state is an insult to the victims of actual apartheid in South Africa and to people whose rights are actually being violated throughout the Middle East in dictatorial and theocratic countries. For people who aren't aware of what the state of affairs is in Israel, Arabs or non-Jews or Muslims or Christians, or however you want to group people who are not seen as Jews, they're citizens. They have the right to vote. They have the right to be part of the military. They serve in the police. They are part of the government. They have political parties. They have the same civil rights as all the other citizens of Israel. So that at just that level, the analogy to South Africa is dishonest. I think it's really, you could say it's overstated or it's based in ignorance, but I think it's basically dishonest. There's another group of people that you could argue are subjected to real deprivation of rights. And I think those are the people who live under the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. So this is the proto-Palestinian state that never came about. And it's in this gray zone, but it's basically an authoritarian regime. It has been for 25 plus years. and the people who are living under Hamas in Gaza since 2005. These are certifiable authoritarian dictatorial regimes. And then, as a result of decades of attacks from those places against Israel, Israel has put in place checkpoints and walls and barriers and security measures. And so what happens is the people who want to beat the drum of apartheid claims against Israel, they will point to the checkpoints, they will point to the security measures, they'll point to the wall, and they will point to those as evidence and restrictions on driving in certain roads, and they'll point to them as, well, this is evidence of apartheid, dropping the whole context of why these security measures are in place and why they weren't in place 30, 40 years ago when there was more, there weren't so many attacks. So the reality is that those are a consequence of aggression from the Palestinian movement, not the result. Their reaction to aggression. They're not the cause of it. And I think that is an important part of the story, that this apartheid claim is context dropping, and purposely so. So I don't think it takes a lot of work to think through what actually are the disanalogies here. I'll say one other thing, which is, this is again something I talk about in the book, that there are issues in Israel about the status of non-Jewish citizens and private discrimination, and then sometimes government discrimination. I think those are problems that need to be addressed. But I think, and I write about those in the book, even if you agree with me that those are problems, I don't think they even come close to the kind of moral status as apartheid, which is just one of the most evil things in the 20th century, the latter part of the 20th century, as an institutionalized form of rights violation. So I think that it's fundamentally wrong and dishonest and evasive about the facts to make this claim. And I think this is part of what students are being fed. And they're being fed this purposely in a way that is playing on their gullibility. So there's more to say about this, because I think that the BDS narrative relies on the apartheid claim, which is basically dishonest. It also relies on other claims, but I just want to see if you have any other thoughts on the apartheid perspective, Onkar.
Yeah, I agree completely. It's a deliberate smear of Israel, and a smear meant, like, who's going to defend apartheid? So if you can put them into that bucket or category, they're damned without any possible defense, because it's the indefensible. So that's the reason they want to put it into that category. But I wanted to go back just to one thing you said, which is about Hamas and their operations in Gaza. So it's true that some of these student protesters know nothing, or worse than nothing, about the Middle East, about Israel. They don't, when they chant from the river to the sea, they can't even name what the river is and what the sea is and what that means. They don't know the geography. But the people who are taking leadership positions in the BDS movement, so they have to be informed of some of what is going on. And here, if you think of the whole run-up to October 7th, and now with Israel bombing in Gaza, the outcries about the civilian population, what did they think would happen? So you have for years Hamas building tunnels, getting arms from Iran and wherever they can get arms from, all with the goal of attacking, and if they ever could get to the strength of being able to wipe out Israel, to wipe out Israel. That's their whole thing. They're not building court systems to bring justice and to protect the rights of Palestinians in Gaza. They're not. Their whole goal, and they've announced it, and then they follow through in action, is we want to destroy Israel. If they are partly successful in that, what do people think will happen to the civilian population in Gaza? Like, how do you fight back against this? They're using deliberate shields of the civilian population. And the fact that there's no outcry in the years prior to October 7th of Hamas is doing this, it's evil, it's a violation of any freedom-loving people in Palestine or in Gaza, it will lead to their death. if they are ever able to attack Israel, as it happened on October 7th. Like, all of that was foreseeable. And yet there's not a continuous outcry about it. There's not a call for the civilized countries in the world of boycotting Hamas. And like, we've got to remove Hamas from power, or else something like this is what the result will be. And it doesn't take a genius to know that. And the absence of that is, for me, that's part of what belies the idea that they actually care about the rights and freedom of Palestinians, versus they're on board with the idea of we've got to dismantle Israel.
I think that's a good observation, that if there were a regime in the Middle East that you would want to impose sanctions on, it would be Hamas in Gaza and the Palestinian Authority regime in West Bank. They are authoritarians and they need to be toppled for those reasons, that you would want to have outcry about them. I wanted to bring up another point in connection with what I think of as the dishonesty of the BDS perspective that students are swallowing or being fed, and just echoing in a religious tribal sort of mindset. And this is one of the claims that comes up. So Israel is, as I've argued in my book, and we've talked about in other podcasts, it's a basically free society. There is the protection of individual rights to a significant extent. It's like many European countries, like the United States, it has its problems, but it's basically free. It's the kind of place you choose to live if you had to choose a place in the Middle East, because it's free and that you have the opportunity to live a good life. Now, one of the things that's true about Israel is that it has become more welcoming of people who are gay and people who identify under the LGBT umbrella terms. And so there's serving in the military, they're serving in police, and openly so, and in government and in parliament. And so this is, I think one would have to see that as a positive step forward. It's progress. It's progress when that happens here in the United States, and it's important to see that as greater. So the expansion of freedom, the expansion of people being given the opportunity to live the life that they want to live. The BDS response to this is that this is so-called pink washing. So if you've heard of whitewashing, or if you've heard of sports washing, these are attempts to sanitize an evil action or evil regime by means of either sports or some other sort of diplomatic means. And pink here is a reference to a color that's associated with the LGBT sort of movement. And so pink washing is you're touting your bona fides, you're saying that it's a welcoming place for gay people, but that's really just a cover. That's not really true. You're only trying to obscure or divert attention from your actual evil, which is how you're treating the Palestinians. And I find this maddening because it fits the kind of model we've been describing, which is it's not grounded in the facts. If you were really thinking about this issue and you were concerned, as one of these websites puts it, Palestine is a queer struggle. If you really thought if you really were concerned about the fate of people who are experiencing prejudice because of their sexual orientation or their gender identification, if you really cared about them, you would look to where are those kinds of rights and where is that kind of freedom possible and actual. And wherever it is absent, including under Hamas, including under the Palestinian Authority, you would have to denounce it. But instead, there's a complete inversion where it actually exists in Israel. They're telling you this is a conspiracy to deceive you. And where it's absent, they're silent. They do not denounce the Palestinian Authority, as far as I've seen. They do not denounce Hamas for killing gay people. And they do not denounce Iran, for example, if you broaden your scope of the Middle East, that routinely hangs gay people or people accused of being gay. It's not even a question of what the facts are, from cranes in the street as an example to deter other people from what they regard as abominations against the Quran. So it's worse than rationalization. They don't want to see the facts. Where they see them, they decry them as a conspiracy to deceive you, as a pink washing campaign. And I think this is further evidence that this whole perspective is not interested in the truth. It's not interested in justice. It's not interested in the ideal of rights, which you would have to be concerned with as a principle governing all people in all places. You can't be selective about its application. So I think when students hear this, and it's packaged for them in the terms of settler colonial strategies for misleading you and making the Arab or Palestinian community look bad, this is a way of deceiving the students and turning them against what is true and good. I wanted to bring up an aspect of this, Onkar, and get your reaction to it. So one of the things that people say as a counter argument is, well, but you're saying Israel is this basically free society. Shouldn't we then hold it to a higher standard compared to other countries in the Middle East on this kind of issue? And I'm just interested in how you respond to that.
It's true that any free or semi-free country you hold to a higher standard. And I think of that in regard, I mean, we're here in the US. Part of the whole trajectory of the US and the US history is the country living up to the Declaration of Independence? And you brought up apartheid in South Africa, but you made a comparison like it was worse than Jim Crow South in the US. But the Jim Crow South was bad, and it was a direct violation of the principles that are at the base of the United States and its right to uphold or to hold America to the standards that it's based on, that its founding fathers have enunciated in the Declaration, and that it's trying to live up to. So I do hold the U.S. government to a higher standard. But what that means is a simultaneous recognition that all kinds of other countries, nations, and governments are through and through corrupt. And the reason you don't hold them to a higher standard is there's no reason to think they're trying to live up to any higher standard. And that's part of what makes them corrupt and what makes them evil. So I'm not going to uphold or hold North Korea to the same standard, and I don't have the same expectations for what they do, because the regime is through and through evil, totalitarian. What it's after is destruction. And if you admit that and recognize that, then it's legitimate to uphold or to hold the U.S. to a higher standard. But if you say, well, Israel is to be held to a higher standard, and we're not going to say anything about all these other regimes as though they're not evil, they're not corrupt, and so there's no expectation for them to do anything good because the whole goals are not good. If you don't admit that about, say, Hamas, that, yeah, I have no expectations Hamas will do anything good because its whole reason for being is to destroy Israel and to try to spread Islam through the world, and that's through and through evil, corrupt, and therefore that's what one would expect in all their actions and all that they do. So there would be a pretense to say, like, why aren't they living up to the Declaration of Independence? They have declared openly that they have contempt for the Declaration of Independence. So there is a meaning to holding the U.S. or Israel to a higher standard, and you would have subjected to criticism that you wouldn't, but to Hamas' sake, but you would subject Hamas to criticism that you would not of Israel or the U.S. And if you don't have that, then it's a pretense of caring about justice to say, oh, but like Israel, don't we have to hold it to a higher standard? You don't actually care about justice in people's individual lives if what that means is, oh, well, why would anybody say anything critical of Hamas?
So one of the things that people say then is, aren't these students and the other people who are part of the BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions crusade, is it just that they're hypocritical? And I'm interested in your perspective. My reaction to that is, it's too kind to them. It's a compliment to call them hypocrites, because I think to be a hypocrite, you first have to acknowledge at some level that you think this is an important standard to live up to or to apply. But for whatever reasons, and there could be different reasons why you don't want to apply, or you're falling short and you're choosing not to put in the effort. But there's some recognition that this is an important principle. And my sense is that many of them don't hold this principle. They don't really care about it, because if they did, they would be taking different actions. So I just want to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I have the same view of that. That a hypocrite, when you're going to use that as an accusation, it's you're not living up to your principles. But there has to be some reason to think that it is their principles, that they have some commitment to it, and then it's too hard in action. It takes too much effort, or it takes courage. People are disagreeing with me, and I've got to stand firm, and I don't do it. And then you can say, well, you're being a hypocrite. You're saying we should live by these principles, but then you don't follow through in action. But there has to be some meaning to that they actually want to live by these principles, that they think these principles are right. And here it's much too much. It's a smokescreen, I think, or at best you can say it's sort of hand waving. We care about rights, but what really animates us is we want to destroy Israel. That's what animates Hamas, and I think it's what animates all the sympathizers with Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran, or the people who just don't. Yeah, they're bad, but what's really driving you is not the principle of rights and freedom, and then you can't live up to it in action. It's something else is really what your principle is and what the goal is, and that's what's driving you. And so the hypocrisy, it's a form of whitewashing. It's a whitewashing of how evil the goal is here.
Well, let's jump to what explains this crusade. And to talk about that, I want to put on screen a tweet from Elon Musk and a response to it from Clifford Asness, who's an investor. He's also a commentator. He writes op-eds and columns in various publications. So let me read out what Elon Musk said. And I think this is in the context of the student protests and some of the reactions to it. So he says, quote, "The axiomatic error undermining much of Western civilization is, quote, weak makes right, unquote. If someone accepts explicitly or implicitly that the oppressed are always the good guys, then the natural conclusion is that the strong are the bad guys," close quote. And then Cliff Asness responds to that, citing something from the Wall Street Journal article he wrote, quote, "Multiple gross failures of the University of Pennsylvania and other schools after October 7th weren't tactical errors or failures of execution. They were an outgrowth of a much broader philosophy that views merit and prosperity as proof of guilt. No society could long survive such a philosophy," close quote. I think these are getting at something really important and true. And I just wanted to hear a bit more from you on this, Onkar, because to me, this gets at some of the philosophical issues that we're talking about.
Yes, they've both, Elon Musk and Cliff Asness have both read Atlas Shrugged, and I think this is something they're taking from Atlas Shrugged, that Atlas really emphasizes that there's something deeply wrong about the whole fundamental moral framework that we're operating with, or increasingly operating with, in the West. And I'm not sure for either of them, they recognize how deep this goes. So if you take Elon Musk, it's the weak makes right. And you put, if you put, like, that's you probably haven't heard that term, that phrase before, weak makes right. But you have heard this, the meek shall inherit the earth. And so when he says it's underpinning much of Western civilization, does he know that this is the essence of the Christian outlook, and which was injected into the lifeblood? It's a poison injected into the lifeblood of Western civilization. That it's the meek, they're entitled to everything. They're the object of all concern, and they will inherit the world, or should. What it really means is they should inherit the world, and maybe in some fantasy afterlife you will, and you can cling to that fantasy. Like, that's the perspective. That it's not a Greek-Roman perspective. It's a Christian perspective that was at war with the Greek-Roman view of morality and of virtue as about strength. But that doesn't mean strength like the muscles. It means ability, the ability to secure, produce, achieve values. And that's what the way Cliff Asness puts it is, I think, right, and it's coming direct from Atlas Shrugged, that it's a broader philosophy that views merit and prosperity as proof of guilt. The Ayn Rand's analysis was what happens is you get a morality that views production, the producer, the creator, two of the words she uses in The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged. There from The Fountainhead, the creator, the scientist, the musician, the businessman, to take from Atlas Shrugged, who build the world. They're the ones, they're the fountainhead. That's part of what the title of the novel means. They're the fountainhead of human life and human progress. And you got a morality that went to war with these people, that no, what they're doing is not good. They're evil. They shouldn't be proud of what they do. They should feel sin and guilt for what they're doing. And that it's, Elon Musk puts it, he says it's undermining much of Western civilization. What one has to understand about Western civilization is it's a conflict between the Greek Roman ideas that are the best of Western civilization and Christian ideas that are the worst of Western civilization. And the more the Christian ideas and ideals dominate, the more you go from you're not on the side of production, creation, building, life. You're on the side of tearing that down. And that, if you view Israel from that perspective, Israel's a builder. It's sometimes called a startup nation. It's now a nation of entrepreneurs, of people who want to build, do things. They're innovative. And that from the perspective of Christianity, and all the secular versions of Christianity, that's a sin. And that has to be battled and warred against. And in that sense, that people view it as this is an Enlightenment versus anti-Enlightenment conflict. That is also true if one understands what the Enlightenment, the essence of what was good and new in the Enlightenment, is a commitment to science, to building wealth, to prosperity, to freedom. And again, if Israel versus the other countries in the Middle East, it stands on one side of that, and the other regimes stand on the other side. And if you're siding with those other regimes and against Israel, it's very revealing. But this is a long-standing and deep intellectual battle. It's not like this is now this is happening like in the 21st century among some like the woke or something like that. That's a trivial analysis of what is actually happening, I think.
I was just going to make a point similar to that, which is that there's been a flurry of analysis of what's happening on college campuses since October 7th, the rise of the so-called woke phenomenon in the last 10 years or so, and analogizing it to religion. And I think there's reasons to think of it in those terms. And it's important to try to understand what is going on campuses. But as you were putting it, this isn't something that started in the 20th century. It didn't start with a small number of leftist intellectuals from Europe who showed up in the United States and started wreaking havoc. They did cause bad outcomes, and they perverted the thinking of many people, but they are themselves the products of this long progression that you're talking about, this deep conflict that goes back millennia, really, not decades. And I think that's part of that kind of perspective is what I've always really valued in Ayn Rand. Like she's not, even when she's talking about the student protests in Columbia in 1968 and at Berkeley, and so many years ago, she didn't see them as just the result of the last 5 years worth of what academics were doing. She understood, she had a kind of a mountaintop philosopher's perspective, which is understanding the progression of ideas and the influence of philosophic ideas across time and vast amounts of time, and just understanding as well. The other aspect of what she says that I find really powerful is she has a really sophisticated view of how ideas shape people's actions and how they shape people's attitudes and assumptions and behavior. And that if you really want to understand the culture, you have to take philosophy seriously. And that's a big part of what she she did in her own commentary on this. So, as you said, Atlas Shrugged is the place to look for her deeper analysis of this issue. And so also in her nonfiction works, you can find that. I think For the New Intellectual is a good place to go for some of this commentary. And then on the issue of this, some of her analysis of how the morality of religion, of Christianity, this altruistic perspective, as she calls it, how that plays out into a kind of nihilism or this desire to tear down the good. That, I think, the place to look for is The Age of Envy, which is I think a seminal essay of hers that people should take a look at. Just one other resource on this, which is today we're publishing in New Ideal an essay by Peter Schwartz, who's an affiliate of the Ayn Rand Institute. It's about the role of philosophic ideas in explaining the sympathizers of Hamas, basically. So a lot of the students and a lot of the people outside campus who have this perspective. So I'll draw your attention to that. I think, and a final thing I will suggest for people interested in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the issues around it, and America's place in that conflict, that my book, What Justice Demands, America and the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict. You can find a link to that in the description here on YouTube, and we'll put it in the show notes. One thing I want to flag in connection with the tweets from Elon Musk and Cliff Asnez is that in my book, I don't go into depth on this issue. It's in the background, but I do mention it, and I put it in terms of, and I call it the underdog premise. And I think a lot of people who've read the book and responded to me, telling me what they thought of it, they found that really helpful, because I think it goes to it's a handy way of understanding this deeper issue. It's a way into the issue. It doesn't exhaust the issue. I just want to acknowledge that my understanding of this is rooted in Ayn Rand's analysis. So people who want to understand it more deeply, yes, it's great that you found that in the book, and I encourage you to read more of the book. Dig deeper and get at the philosophic conflict that Ayn Rand is analyzing and exposing, I think, really dramatically in Atlas Shrugged and other of her essays. So that's a plug for reading further into Ayn Rand's works. Any final thoughts, Onkar, before we close for today?
Well, we got a few super chat contributions, so thank you everyone for that. We appreciate that. And I don't know if you want to take, we got a few questions as well, if you want to take those.
Sure, let me take it.
So I can take one. So I think this has to do with the issue of boycotts and divestment. One of the questions was, how many American corporations are investing money in Hamas? That's not the issue. I would put the issue wider than that. Who's giving to Hamas, including the aid organizations, including the UN? Now, the U.S. government also gives to the Palestinian Authority. So if you're calling for divestment, and remember, it's boycott, divestment, sanctions, it's why is the U.S. government giving, and other Western organizations, why are they giving to Hamas? Why are the whole, and if you put I'll put the UN into this because it's a major player here. Why are they propping up these corrupt regimes? If you don't have a focus on that, so it's too narrow to think of it, well, is there some American company that's directly funding Hamas versus is America and the American government, and so the American taxpayers, are they contributing to these corrupt organizations? And I think the answer to that, unfortunately, is yes. And if you labeled these and understood these as evil, it would be a major issue of why is money going to these regimes.
Yeah, I think one of the things for people to think about, just to amplify an aspect of what you're raising, after October 7th, one of the things that came out is there was a UN sub-agency that's dedicated to supporting Palestinian refugees in Gaza. It's called UNRWA. That's how people pronounce its acronym. And one of the things that was discovered is 12 or so, maybe more, employees of this UN agency were involved in the attack of October 7th. And then beyond that, there were UNRWA schools where, for a long time, not even before October 7th, it was known and documented that they're peddling anti-Jewish, anti-Israel, pro-martyrdom type content to students, to young children. And then when you there was an outcry against this, and a number of the European and international donors to UNRWA said, okay, whoa, hold on, this is too much for us. We're going to stop donating. We're going to hold back our money. We can't have people who work for UNRWA slaughtering Israelis and then filming themselves and glorifying mass murder. And then a few weeks later, it went back to, well, we have to keep the money going. And how could we stop? How could we punish them for this, for actually being part of Hamas, being sympathetic to Hamas, being supporters of Hamas? And that's a really telling example of the power of this moral premise that is poisoning Western society, which is, even when they're killing people, even when the agents of Hamas are part of this UN organization, there's nothing that can disqualify this UN organization from receiving money. They're serving the meek. They're the ones who deserve it. And the fact that the Israelis are in this context the victims, that's irrelevant. And I think reading about that is just, it's horrifying, because the people giving the donations, the governments of Norway and other countries, they're disarmed. And in fact, it's not just that they're disarmed because they lack arguments. They actually believe this. This is the premise that animates them. And it leads to horrific results. It literally means that these countries, including the United States through various means, have been enabling Hamas for many, many years, not just in material means, but in giving them a sanction, a moral endorsement by implication. So I think there's a lot to think about here, and that I would emphasize the moral dimension of this and why it keeps happening, and why no one is outside of commentary that we put out, people are not pushing back against this because they're disarmed by this prevailing view of morality. And this is part of what, just to tie it back to Atlas Shrugged, so do read Atlas Shrugged, because this is part of what she exposes about the perniciousness of this idea. So there's lots of other questions. Let's see if I can respond to one, and then maybe we'll close with that. So there's a question here about my claim about the apartheid state in Israel, and the questioner, or is it more of a claim, how I can't, as a Muslim, walk in the certain streets in Hebron, which is in the West Bank. How is that not apartheid? That's what the person says. And I will say in response to that is that we didn't get to this, but I think there's important things to say about the actions of certain fanatical Jews in Israel who are, in my view, opposed to individual rights. And they take actions, including settling on other people's property and trespassing and squatting and carrying out immoral and illegal actions. I think of those as contrary to what Israel is about, contrary to the principles that I'm defending. And I regard them as a part of the problem. They're violating the rights of Palestinians. Hebron is a complicated case because what they've done in this city is, in this town, is a lot of these fanatical Jews have moved in and they demand protection because there's a lot of conflict with the Arab Palestinian population going back decades. And there's so few of them that it's sort of like a garrison town. So I think there is a problem there. I wouldn't classify that as apartheid. I would describe that as one of the destructive consequences of there being a really strong religionist lobby group in Israel that leads to bad policy. And it's not the only example of it. I refer you to my book where I talk about some other examples of this. That's a problem it needs to be rooted out. I really don't think anyone should regard that as apartheid, because it's not a conscious goal that is inherent in the system. It's a deviation from what the system is about, the system of government. It's where the system is failing, not what it's designed to do. Apartheid was designed to keep the blacks down purposely on explicitly religious grounds. What you're describing here is a failure of the system to live up to its actual principles. So that'd be a short way to address that.
Let me just say one other thing on that, one other element on it, which is about the religious aspect of this, that I agree with you. It's a problem, the religiosity of some of these Orthodox Jews and what that leads them to do, and why what they're doing is in violations of if you think of Israel is a secular country devoted to freedom and rights. It's in violation of that. But if you had that view about the Orthodox Jews in Israel, you have to have that view about the hundreds of thousands pushing Islam throughout the Middle East. And then, so you would have a real problem with all kinds of people in Gaza who think, yeah, like the Islam and the state should be welded together. And then throughout Saudi Arabia, Iran, but that's what, if you actually cared about this versus looking for something to attack Israel, it would be, oh my God, the way that religion is enmeshed in most of the Middle East and in some segments of Israel is becoming more of a dominant force. That's a real problem, and it's a problem throughout the region.
All right, I think we should draw a line here. Thanks everyone for watching today. We'll be back with another episode next week. And in the meantime, take a look at the resources we have in the description and the show notes, and we hope to see you next time. Thanks.